The year was 1930, and in the humid air of Cuba, a life began that was destined to be broken by science. A female chimpanzee, later known as Gua, was born into a world of cages and observation, a gift donated to the Yerkes National Primate Research Center. But while most primates in research were kept behind iron bars, Gua's fate was far more intimate and far more unsettling. She was to be the centerpiece of a psychological theater directed by Winthrop Kellogg, a man obsessed with the thin, fragile line between man and beast. Kellogg was a scientist who looked at the stories of feral children, those raised by wolves in the dark of the forest, not with pity, but with a cold, academic envy. He believed that if a human could become a wolf, then an animal, if cradled in the arms of civilization, could become a man. To prove this, he needed a controlled environment. He needed a house that looked like a home, and a child that would serve as a sacrifice for data. When his son Donald was born, Kellogg didn't just see a son, he saw a unique opportunity, a baseline for a comparative nightmare. In June 1931, at only 7 months old, Gua was forcibly taken from her mother's scream and placed into the Kellogg household. She wasn't brought in as a pet, but as a sister to 10-month-old Donald. Two infants, two different species, bound together in a domestic experiment that would eventually blur the very definition of what it means to be human. The stage was set for a mirror to be placed in front of a child, a mirror that would eventually start to stare back with its own primal hunger. The obsession began long before the ape arrived. Winthrop Kellogg was a man of cold logic, a scientist at Indiana University whose mind was consumed by the intricate dance between nature and nurture. During his years at Columbia in 1927, he became fixated on the harrowing tales of feral children, infants who, by some cruel twist of fate, were raised by wolves in the wild. He observed how these children did not maintain their humanity. Instead, they surrendered to their environment, learning to howl, hunt, and live as beasts because that was what their world demanded of them. Kellogg began to wonder if the process could be reversed. He theorized that if a wild animal were placed in a human cradle, the power of nurture might override its primal heredity, effectively humanizing the creature. But to prove such a radical theory, he needed more than just a chimpanzee. He needed a human control subject, a living benchmark to measure the descent or ascent of the soul. The birth of his son, Donald, provided the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. Supported by the Social Science Research Council and eugenicist Robert Yerkes, the Kelloggs moved to Florida to begin their descent into the unknown. Gua, a 7.5-month-old chimpanzee, was chosen to be the mirror for their 10-month-old son. She was to be treated not as a laboratory animal, but as a member of the family, clothed, bathed, and pushed in a pram just like Donald. The goal was a perfect simulation of brotherhood, where the only allowed path of learning was the human way. Winthrop Kellogg had built a sanctuary of science, but as the two infants were introduced in the summer of 1931, the walls of that sanctuary began to feel more like a cage for the human spirit. In the summer of 1931, the quiet halls of the Kellogg home became the stage for a forced siblinghood. Gua and Donald were introduced at the ages of 7.5 and 10 months respectively, and from that moment on, they were treated in every conceivable way as brother and sister. Winthrop and Luella were meticulous in their mimicry of a normal upbringing. Both infants were fed by bottle, bathed in the same tub, and pushed around the neighborhood in a pram, side by side. The chimpanzee was not a guest. She was a daughter, dressed in night clothing and tucked into a cot with clean linens. When her bed was temporarily removed, she would cry out in despair, her need for comfort and routine echoing the vulnerability of a human child. However, as the daily routine settled into a clinical rhythm, starting with a 7 a.m. wake-up and ending with an 18:30 bedtime, a subtle, unsettling shift began to manifest. While Donald followed the slow, expected trajectory of a human infant, Gwa was accelerating. She adapted to the human world with a terrifying speed that her human brother could not match. She mastered self-feeding with a spoon by 13 months, a feat that took Donald nearly half a year longer to achieve. She learned to navigate the house, opening heavy swinging doors, and even understanding the correlation between a light switch and the sudden illumination of a bulb. The bond between them grew deeper, but it was tinted with an uncanny quality. Gwa would hold out her hands for Donald to stroke her hair, and she would make a frantic beeline for him whenever he entered the room. If Gwa was scolded, Donald, in a display of pure, innocent empathy, would approach the ape and hug her. To the Kellogg's, it seemed their experiment was succeeding. Gwa was learning very human-like emotional responses, even seeking kisses as a form of forgiveness for her mistakes. But while the chimpanzee was learning the grace of a human child, the house was becoming a laboratory of the strange, where the lines between the wild and the civilized were slowly beginning to dissolve. As the months passed, the domestic facade of the Kellogg home began to crack, revealing the cold, clinical machinery of the experiment beneath. Winthrop Kellogg's curiosity turned toward the physical and psychological foundations of his two children, leading to tests that bordered on the macabre. He became fascinated by the hardening of their bone structures, specifically the development of their skulls. In a display of detached scientific inquiry, Kellogg would take a spoon and strike both Donald and Gwa on the head, listening intently to the resonance of the impact. While Donald's skull produced a dull, soft thud, Gwa's made a harsher, more metallic sound, proving that the ape's body was maturing with a predatory swiftness that the human boy could not hope to reach. The atmosphere in the house grew even more tense as Kellogg sought to measure their primal reactions to fear. With a motion picture camera whirring in the background to capture every flinch, he stood behind the unsuspecting infants and fired a revolver into the air. The sudden, violent crack of the gunshot sent waves of terror through both subjects. But the footage told a chilling story. Gwa's reflexes were superior, her nervous system reacting with the speed born of the jungle, leaving Donald struggling to process the trauma. The world was witnessing a race where the human was losing, and the house was filled with the sounds of crying and the smell of gunpowder. Despite the human upbringing, the wild was refusing to be suppressed. While Gwa slept in her clean linens and wore her night clothing, she began to exhibit a haunting, hereditary instinct, tearing at her bedding to construct a nest, a behavior she had never seen but carried in her blood from the treetops of Africa. She was a creature of contradictions, a sister who could use a spoon and open doors, yet one who barked at the neighbor's dog and grew terrified of the very birds in the trees. The mirror was breaking. The more Gwa mirrored a human child, the more her innate, superior physical power made Donald look fragile, slow, and increasingly out of place in his own home. As the experiment reached its 9th month, the Kellogg home fell into a silence that was far from peaceful. It was the silence of a human identity eroding. While Gwa had successfully learned to communicate her needs through physical gestures, pointing to her mouth for food or tugging on trousers to indicate she needed the toilet, she had hit an invisible wall. Her vocalizations remained trapped in a primal repertoire of oohs, ahs, and grunts. She understood the human world, reacting to nearly 95 spoken words and commands, but she could never truly join it. However, the most terrifying development wasn't what the ape couldn't do. It was what the boy was beginning to do in her place. Donald, who had initially struggled to keep up with his sister's mobility, had finally begun to master walking and climbing, but his social development was taking a dark, unexpected turn. Isolated from other children and immersed in the company of a primate, the 10-month-old boy began to treat Gwa not just as a sister, but as a leader. The human speech that should have been blossoming in him was becoming stunted. At an age where children usually begin to form a bridge to the world through language, Donald had only mastered 6 words. Instead of mama or papa, the sounds echoing through the hallways were the sounds of the wild. The Kellogg's watched in horror as their son began to abandon his humanity. Donald started to communicate through barks and screeches, mirroring the exact vocalizations of his chimpanzee sibling. When he was frustrated, he didn't cry. He screamed with a guttural simian intensity. He would ooh, like an ape to express his emotions, his behavior a chilling testament to Kellogg's theory of nurture. Only it was the animal's nurture that was winning. The mirror had worked too well. By March 1932, Luella Kellogg could no longer ignore the reality. They weren't raising a human-like ape. They were losing their son to the forest. The experiment had to die before Donald's humanity did. The end came with a cold, surgical abruptness on March 28, 1932. On Luella Kellogg's insistence, the experiment was terminated, and the domestic illusion was shattered. Gwa, who had spent 9 months being kissed, clothed, and tucked into bed as a human daughter, was evicted from the only home she truly remembered. She was sent back to Robert Yerkes' research center, where the soft linens of the Kellogg house were replaced by the iron bars of a laboratory cage. The trauma of being twice ripped from her perceived family took its toll. Less than a year later, on December 21, 1933, the chimpanzee who almost became a girl died of pneumonia at the age of 3. She died caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Back in Indiana, the Kellogg's returned to a conventional life, publishing their findings in a book that polarized the world. Winthrop Kellogg expressed a quiet disappointment that Gwa had hit a wall in her development, unable to master the final human frontier, language. He concluded that nurture could only push the soul so far before nature reclaimed its territory. Yet, the scientific community remained haunted by the ethics of the study. The gunshot tests, the skull tapping with spoons, and the deliberate use of an infant son as a clinical control. They had sought to humanize an animal, but in the process, they had treated their own flesh and blood as a specimen. The shadows of those 9 months followed Donald Kellogg for the rest of his life. Although he eventually regained his speech and went on to study medicine and psychiatry, the mark of the experiment seemed indelible. In 1973, just a year after both of his parents had passed away, Donald took his own life at the age of 43. Whether the barks and screeches of his infancy were truly buried, or whether they left a hollow space where a human identity should have been, remains a mystery. The experiment had proven that a child could be mirrored into a beast, but it also left a chilling lesson. Some mirrors, once broken, can never be made whole again.